Hi, I'm consciousness researcher and philosopher Jussi Julke, and I recently did a psychedelic work trip to know what it is and how it could inform my own research. And why I did it personally is because consciousness is a topic that you cannot completely know uh, from an objective perspective. Uh, it is widely known that there is an epistemic gap between science and subjective experiences. In practice, this means that based on empirical science alone, you cannot even infer that consciousness exists. So, as you probably know, there is lots of hype about psychedelics in recent scientific literature, mainly because they are very promising uh, psychiatric medicines, if you could say, um, or like instruments in therapy. Uh, this is called psychedelically assisted psychotherapy. So there is no point in just ingesting a psychedelic substance with no preparatory work and integrative work, like before and after the experience. You have to prepare and you have to be clear about your intentions for the trip. In psychedelic therapy, the patient is given a psychedelic substance and they undergo a very intensive psychedelic trip. And the goal of the therapy is to produce a mystical experience in the patient. And the mystical experience is what helps the patient. There is evidence that the therapeutic effect is mediated by the mystical experience. And this is extremely interesting uh, from a philosophical perspective. Typically, we think in biomedical terms that you have some illness that you cure by targeting some molecular mechanism, as in antibiotics treat inflammation, they kill bacteria. And then we have better applied to psychiatric sickness or problems. We have the biopsychosocial model, which also acknowledges the role of psychological processes in like underlying mental problems. But the psychedelic paradigm doesn't really fit into these approaches because it is a spiritual paradigm. That the person undergoes a mystical experience, a spiritual experience. They often describe that they have encountered the ultimate nature of reality or God. And that is what probably, according to evidence, is the mechanism underlying the healing process. And it's quite obvious how this differs from the biomedical perspective, because the biomedical perspective doesn't really take into account consciousness at all. But how should we fit into the biopsychosocial paradigm this spirituality? Because if you undergo a mystical experience, part of its defining characteristic set of characteristics is that this what is called noetic quality. It's felt as true, veridical and real. It's not just an illusion, or it's not only psychology, as in here I perceive the camera in front of me, and it's not only psychology because my judgment that there is a camera in front of me, it is true or false. So also if I believe that the universe is a cosmic consciousness, and suppose that I would be suffering from terminal illness like cancer, then I might find this idea of cosmic consciousness consoling. I wouldn't fear death so much as I did previously. So this belief, or these kinds of beliefs, there are many kinds. They are metaphysical beliefs, beliefs about the nature of reality. Everything is one big mind or cosmic consciousness, or some people experience that everything is love, penetrated by this cosmic universal love. Or belief in God, that there is a loving God, that I don't know how to describe it further. But they are metaphysical beliefs, and it would not do justice to them to just to psychologize them, to treat them as just like psychological processes, because people believe that they are true, just like my belief that there is a camera in front of me. So how could they be true? That is the question I have been pondering lately. So I am myself a materialist. I believe that everything is matter, but I'm not a materialist in this typical sense that you usually encounter in textbooks, because I think that there are good reasons to believe that we don't know what matter is, at least based on science alone. I believe that matter is consciousness. And let's not go into that further. This belief of mine is actually based on a mystical experience I had about more than 10 years ago, without the aid of any psychedelic techniques. It was completely spontaneous, and ever since I have been trying to capture it in words. But so I basically had already this kind of conviction that in the cosmic consciousness, if you like to call it in that way. So I am myself, I am a like living example of a person who tries to reconcile these spiritual beliefs in their natural scientific world view. But I didn't know whether psychedelically induced mystical experiences, to what extent they are similar to spontaneous mystical experience like the one I had. And I didn't know it was a mystical experience until I encountered this psychedelic literature. And I found that what I experienced spontaneously was in fact closely similar to what people experience when they take psychedelics. And interestingly, most analytical philosophers, for example, among other people, didn't understand my ideas, but those who had taken psychedelics or who had undergone mystical experiences spontaneously, they knew, they understood me. So my question then is, to what extent is this spontaneous mystical experience similar to a psychedelic experience? I had this spontaneous mystical experience, but not a psychedelic experience. And also, I was interested in reconciling this materialistic or scientific worldview with the psychedelically induced mystical experience. I was interested in whether those metaphysical insights that you undergo in a psychedelic mystical experience, whether they are compatible with a materialistic or naturalistic worldview. And this is quite important if we start using psychedelics in therapy. If a person is healed through a belief or conviction that a cosmic consciousness or God exists, then if that belief is contradictory with the scientific worldview, then we could say that, at least from a scientific perspective, it is an illusion. And there is an ethical problem in treating people with mental problems by inducing in them false beliefs. That is a bit like brainwashing, and it produces a discrepancy between the scientific worldview and their post-psychedelic worldview. And this is especially pressing if the person themselves believe or believed prior to their experience, psychedelic experience, they believed in the scientific worldview. And if there is this discrepancy, like after the mystical experience, that they cannot reconcile this pre and post worldviews, then that is a problem. So in my own psychedelic experience, my aim was to find out what kinds of insights it would give me, and whether they are compatible with my naturalistic worldview. So, lately I have felt that I should give a work trip report, like a more complete than I have previously done, because I have been so open about doing the trip. And I have made many videos and tried to write about it, but you know what the problem is. The psychedelic experience, one of its hallmarks is that it is ineffable. And indeed, it is. So that's why I haven't been able to really put it into words. So I don't have much time. I try to list now the key aspects that I underwent. I had this strong sense of unity with the material world. I felt, literally felt, not just conceptually believed, that I'm made of matter, the same matter as that piece of chocolate I had in my hand. I felt in my body, viscerally knew, not just conceptually, how that chocolate, when I eat it, it will transform into my consciousness. And that is what literally happens according to the standard scientific picture. My consciousness is a neural process and it consumes the energy from the chocolate. And then I had these ideas of hydrogen and oxygen, how they form water, how it's so amazing that how they combine, and hydrogen is a process and oxygen is a process, and alone one is one we can breathe and the other is it can explode. So they have these kinds of properties, and when they form this interaction process, when they form water, H2O, that interaction process, when they combine, you can conceive that as a process. That process is more than the sum of its parts. And I somehow felt this very strongly. Again, it's a standard scientific fact, but I just somehow felt how significant it is. And it is significant because without water, without this weird combination of hydrogen and oxygen, we wouldn't exist here. There would be no life. So it's wondrous how these simpler substances are combined into one, and they become more than the sum of its parts. And this is related to my thoughts about how consciousness emerges, how atoms form molecules, and the molecules form neurons, and the neurons start interacting, and that interaction process is this consciousness here. And usually we know this only like conceptually, but then I knew it viscerally. I really felt how that is true, and how everything is literally the same, and we usually call it matter, and matter is the same as this consciousness here. To call it cosmic consciousness would be like a step further, and that requires extra argumentation. But I felt this, that I'm made of the same stuff as everything else. So there was this sense of unity, but I wouldn't say that all matter is consciousness in the same sense as I am consciousness, but it is in the same continuum in any way. And then I had this strong feeling that, or like empathy for Descartes. As a philosopher, I know Descartes well. I felt Descartes' loneliness. We had fire burning there, and I was thinking about solipsism, how, like, even though we are all made of the same matter, still we are distinct organisms. You there are distinct from me. You cannot feel my feelings, I cannot feel your feelings. We are doomed to distinctness. And I felt somehow in Descartes, he doubted the existence of the whole external world. So he also doubted the existence of other people, like solipsism. So he was like completely alone, like almost like in this schizophrenic style. But then and of course I knew that I'm not Descartes, it was not psychotic, but I felt Descartes' loneliness, how when we like follow this line of thought of doubting everything besides our own consciousness, how we end up in this isolation of doubting everything else. And then I somehow felt how Princess Elizabeth, which was Descartes' pupil, Descartes taught her, but she raised criticism against Descartes' substance dualism, that how if matter and mind interact, how can they be completely distinct, as in Descartes' dualism they are. This Descartes' dualism is interestingly related to these skeptical scenarios of doubting the external world, and I am myself personally convinced, or I believe, that we just happen to call what is outside of us, we call it matter, but ourselves we call mental. So it's a matter of perspective. So I think Descartes also ended up in this substance dualism based on the solipsistic skeptical method. He ended up thinking that everything that is physical he can doubt its existence, but mind, his own mind, he cannot doubt. So basically Descartes' dualism boils down to not to distinctness between mind and matter, but instead to distinctness between Descartes himself and everything not Descartes. Me, myself, and everything not me. Like mental, physical. And I've somehow felt how Princess Elizabeth popped the solipsistic bubble of Descartes by showing that when mind and matter interact, when I interact with you, that proves that you are not in this complete isolation after all. So that was one line of thought. I will just list these because I cannot really, it would be artificial to make a narrative out of them. What else? Well, an interesting period during the trip that I want to mention here is when I again fell into this deep loneliness. I fell again into this Plato's cave, like where everything else is just, we just see shadows of the external world, not the external world itself. Or Descartes' solipsism, where we doubt the existence of everything else, including other people. At one point I fell into this infinite loneliness. And I said to others, I am sad. I am really sad. And I was sad because I felt this distinctness between myself and everything else. So it's the contrary to the sense of unity that you usually have defined in the defining characteristics of mystical experience. I was in this deep separation from everything else. And I described it in biblical terms. Like in paradise, we are one with everything. There is no self and no other. But when we are born, we are like deported from the paradise. We become distinct from everything else. And that is the human condition where we are, we never can really reach another person. We never can really like feel another person. We never can become one in this world. We are doomed to isolation. And that was the reason for my deep sorrow. And I also felt how in death we become one again. And these insights are also compatible with natural science. When an organism is born, you can model it in theoretical biology that it has the Markov blanket that defines its boundary between the external world and the organism itself. So it is, as long as it lives, it is separate from everything else. Separate organisms are like separated by Markov blankets. They have efferent and afferent connections like actions and senses. They can interact, but they cannot become one. So nothing supernatural here either. But then, from the solitude, and I was thinking about death, becoming one again. And usually we think of death as black. But then I saw that death is white. And I started thinking about this, like Aldous Huxley's reducing valve theory, and it's also from William James and Henry Bergson, that it's difficult to explain, but I will put it really simply, that matter in itself is like white light. Think of the Big Bang, where everything was just energy, the singularity, and it started to transform into like atoms and elements and then molecules and then us. So it's kind of a process of reducing this pure energy into something else. And this was just like this ineffable idea. I cannot really put it into words. I should study more this idea and how to reconcile it with materialism. So it is like I said, that if matter in itself is this like light, pure light, then we are the darkness. Because we, as like analogous to the prism, we reduce the white light into different colors, like our forms of consciousness. That is difficult. I'm sorry, I cannot explain it better. I felt that it was true. And I don't mean that from the fact that I felt it as true, that it would be true. But I think that there was something in the experience that I felt as true, and I think could be explained in line with natural science. Professor David Nutt, in a recent Philosophy of Psychedelics conference, a really well-known senior professor specialized in drug science, said that modern brain science proves Huxley and Bergson right when we have this brain data. And when your brain activity is reduced in a psychedelic experience, your consciousness is expanded. So when you like reduce matter into its lower forms, consciousness actually becomes somehow increased. So I think there are some strategies to reconcile this idea with natural science, but I won't go into that deeper now. So I felt that in death we become one with that white light, unity, oneness, like this like fundamental level of being. It's ineffable. But so that was a like metaphysical sense of unity that is common in mystical experiences. And previously I had a similar experience in realizing that everything is matter, and in that sense one, and consciousness is matter, matter is consciousness, so everything is one. And at least that is naturalistically completely unproblematic statement. I can define that or defend that in more detail elsewhere. But then something else I should mention as well, still something. Yes, I still felt that I was separate from the other persons, even though I knew that they are made of the same matter as I am. I knew that they have the same inner life as I do. I still was wondering about this like boundary between us as separate organisms. I was wondering how to become one as distinct persons. And then we started drumming. As you might know, I do these sound meditations where this sense of unity happens quite easily during drumming. And when you do it together with other people, well, at least I feel I become one with everything that is happening. And so there is just the process of drumming, or the process of happening without representing it as drumming, or without representing myself as distinct from the other drummers or players. And it all forms a unitary process where we just listen and create the sound simultaneously. And that is what happened during that evening as well. We started drumming like this simple monotonous rhythm, and then when you start listening to everybody else, it starts to become something more. It's the same as I was describing with hydrogen and oxygen, when they like the two processes, hydrogen process and the oxygen process, they start interacting with each other. They form like this dance, and the dance is water. And water is more than the sum of its parts. This is modeled in science in, for example, integrated information theory. It's not applied to water, but I think it could be applied to water as well. It's usually applied to consciousness research. And it's another question when we start drumming together and form this integrative process, whether it has like this, whether it constitutes this maximally integrated information structure that IIT talks about, like the integrated information theory talks about. I think that could be possible, but I don't think it's like completely relevant right now. But I was dissolved. I became the drumming process. I sat in a rocking chair and my friend gave me this udu, this African drum, and I was playing it and I heard everybody else playing, and then gradually there was no longer me or the drum or the others or the sound. There was just an ineffable process, a brute process happening that was all one. So it was a complete, as they call it, a complete ego dissolution experience, and it felt wonderful. I felt united with the others. I got like past this sense of isolation, this tragedy of human existence of being isolated. So I have to stop. In the long term, what it taught me, I think that's the topic of another video. Here I wanted just to mention these metaphysical insights. And finally, before stopping, I should say that I don't recommend it to anyone, because I see how dangerous it can be, because it can raise very difficult emotions. I haven't talked about personal stuff here, but it can raise very difficult personal issues that lay latent in yourself. And if you don't have the resources or the support to deal with them, traumas or anything you might encounter, then there is a risk of like big problems. So this is like unfortunate if you suffer from treatment-resistant depression, for example, and you are willing to try anything you don't have in most countries this way to try this kind of treatment in a safe and legal environment. But I don't recommend it to anyone. But if someone still decides to do that, I recommend that they like read a lot and they meditate a lot, and ideally they should go to psychotherapy to discuss these plans and find some integrative therapist that is willing to help in integrating the experience. But there is lots of documentation about this online. But yes, I just wanted to share this experience. Even though it is ineffable, it cannot be conceptualized, it cannot be really described, it cannot be really shared, but I still wanted to try my best because I feel it's my duty, because I have started to do this like completely openly. Thank you.